Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us from across the globe for this CGAP and FinEquity webinar on tackling the root causes of women's financial exclusion. We are organizing this webinar as part of the World Bank Group's initiative, Gender, Equity and Development Plus 10, Accelerate Equality, which explores progress and lessons learned over the last 10 years to promote gender equality. Now, today we're going to talk about restrictive gender norms that are often the root cause of persistent gender inequality in financial markets. And we know that ignoring them can limit the effectiveness and the impact of financial inclusion interventions. Gender norms, however, are inescapable. They are a reality. They shape the lives of women and women around the world, of men and women around the world. But let me define them first before we get into the substance of this seminar. What we call gender norms are a subset of social norms that represent collectively held expectation and perceived rules about how individuals should behave based on their gender identity. They are visible in the division of labor and allocation of resources within and outside the household, as well as in the expectation placed on men and women. Their consequences are actually far-ranging as they foster the development of different abilities, attitudes, and desires. For example, collective expectations around childcare and household responsibility mean that women spend significant amounts of time on unpaid care and domestic work, such as cooking, cleaning, taking care of children, the elderly, limiting their time for other productive activities, such as operating or expanding a business. Similarly, similar norms affect the ability of women to access and use financial services. So we know these norms are prevailing everywhere, and they play a very important role. But these norms can change. And in fact, we have examples where they have changed. And quite remarkably, we've seen that financial services themselves can help address some harmful gender norms. So we'll talk about examples during this webinar. But the reason we're here today really is because we, the funders, the development partners, the market players, we can support the transformation that is needed to improve women's financial inclusion and economic empowerment. By understanding and accounting for these gender norms, we can contribute to developing a gender-equitable financial system that allows both men and women to benefit equally from economic opportunities. In today's webinar, you will hear from several funders about how they tackle gender norms in their work to increase the effectiveness of their operation. But before we listen to them and we start our discussion, let me highlight a few housekeeping items. First of all, we're going to have time in the seminar for Q&A, but I would like to ask you that you put your questions in the chat, and a colleague from FinEquity will collect them as we discuss and share them with me so we can tackle them by group. I would like also to encourage you to look at the chat because our colleagues will put in the chat relevant resources as we discuss different elements. Please also note that the seminar is being recorded and that the recording, as well as all the key resources, the presentation, and responses to questions that we may not have the time to address during the seminar will all be made available next week on the FinEquity website. So with that introduction, let me start with not all panelists, we'll get to them in a minute, but with a poll. I'd like to get to you, our audience, and ask you two questions. And I think I'm going to be helped by technology. The first question really is a true or false question. And we're asking you whether you believe that it is true or false that during the pandemic, loan applications from women-led businesses have been rejected at twice the rate of those from male-led businesses. And I can see that there is a fairly large agreement on the fact, or the false part is growing, but there's a fairly large majority of you that believes the answer to this question is true, and indeed, it is true. Fundamentally, norms about women's economic roles might be contributing to financial service providers assuming that women businesses are less creditworthy, riskier to lend to, which in turn then leads to higher rejections. But that is not based on evidence. The second question that we'd like to ask you is the following. How many countries do you think maintain legal barriers that prevent women from full economic participation? Is it none? Is it 65, 178, 112? I'm going to give you a bit more time. Well, it seems that you are underestimating collectively how difficult the situation is for women legally in the world, because the correct answer is actually 178. And if you look at the World Bank's report on women's and the law, you would see that it is actually very, very widespread. And this may be the case because in reality, so-called gender-neutral policy making may in fact inadvertently creating barriers for women's economic participation by perpetuating constraining gender norms. What is clear in this introduction basically is that gender norms create an unlevel playing field for women and limit their ability to access and use financial services to improve their lives and livelihoods and that of their household. So now we're going to turn to our panel to kick us off with some very interesting thoughts. So let me first introduce them. We have with us Hajnalka Petrics, who is the global coordinator of the JOHN program on gender transformative approaches for food security and nutrition, implemented by the FAO, IFAD, and WFP in collaboration with and with funding from the European Union. That program has partnered with CARE Malawi to conduct a gendered social norms diagnostic on access to financial services by women and youth in 5 districts in Malawi. And we're going to hear about their experience there. We also have with us Florian Berndt, who is a senior advisor at GIZ's Financial Systems Development Unit. He's focusing on financial inclusion and is responsible for responsible finance topics and had various long-term positions on site, including as general manager of a microfinance institution and as program director at the central bank. GIZ is currently undertaking a social norms diagnostic in Tunisia in the context of a financial inclusion project financed by BMZ and implemented with the Ministry of Economy, Finance and Investment Support. And we're going to hear about that experience. Ankita Singh is a research and insight specialist at the Center for Financial Health, hosted at UNCDF. She's currently leading the research work under the Mission Shakti Living Lab in Odisha, India. The Center for Financial Health has partnered with the government of Odisha under their flagship project, Mission Shakti, that aims to realize financial health outcome for 3.5 million women and build 10,000 women enterprises that help them advance their agency over their financial life. And finally, we'll hear from Antonique Koning, who is a gender lead at CGAP and a senior financial sector specialist. Antonique is also the co-author of CGAP's technical guide on addressing gender norms in financial inclusion that we will talk a lot about today. In her role as gender lead, she supports CGAP colleagues to integrate a gender lens across our work. She also chairs the Technical Advisory Committee of FinEquity, the community of practice on women's financial inclusion convened by CGAP. So with those introductions, let me now turn first to Antonique, who's going to share with us how gender norms are shaping the behavior of various actors in the financial market and creating barriers for women's financial inclusion and their economic empowerment. Antonique.
Thank you very much, Sophie. That was a wonderful introduction and a good way to set the stage also with the answers to the polls, I would say. As you already indicated in your introduction, harmful gender norms really prevent women from being fully financially included. And of course, while we know that women's financial inclusion is not the end all be all, it's only a means to an end, be it for increasing incomes for women, creating greater capabilities and opportunities. We also know that the realization of those outcomes is often hindered by these norms. And that's why it's so important for all of us to better understand which norms and why and how they influence the functioning of the financial market system. And you already mentioned the guide that CGAP produced to better understand how you can address gender norms to increase financial inclusion, how you can design interventions to do that properly. What is important to realize, I think, is that oftentimes we look at the behavior of women and how women are affected by gender norms. And obviously, that is really important. On the demand side, gender norms can form barriers to women's mobility, their engagement in the productive economy, their financial decision making or ownership or control over assets, for instance, or even accessing mobile phones. And all of these things we know have an effect on whether women can actually access, use, and benefit from the use of financial services. But what is also important is to understand how these gender norms actually play a role in in the view of other actors in the financial market. The supply side, for instance, the financial service providers, to start off with. Often, gender norms actually lead to barriers such as biases in algorithms, inappropriate product offerings, and inadequate delivery channels. These biases are usually unconscious. For example, financial service provider staff may not realize that they're treating women differently than men when assessing their ability to run a business. And I just saw a comment in the chat relating to the poll question about what happened during COVID. And indeed, often before already COVID started, there was a misperception, I think, of women's ability to run businesses and take credit and respond to that. As Sophie said, there is no evidence for that being actually the case. So on the supply side, gender norms do play an important role as well. And then similarly in other areas of the financial market system, be it banking regulation and policies, payment platforms, agent networks, they may appear gender neutral because they're supposed to be for everyone in the market and everyone in the sector. But they often fail to consider that women may not have the same choices or not have the same capacities than men, be it due to their limited mobility, for instance, or disproportionate care burden that Sophie already alluded to. So collectively, these barriers limit women's access and use to financial services and the benefit that they really can extract from that. So just filling the gender gap in and of itself won't solve it. We have to go deeper and we have to look deeper. On this slide, you just see an illustration. It's a very simplified version of what happens, may happen in a market. And we've actually elaborated a little bit on that in our technical guide. But it really goes to this point of diagnosing the situation beyond what women's behavior is and what women can and cannot do, to also see how gender norms are affecting others in the market system. And if you look at the middle column here, you see the behavior of two system actors, the financial service providers and the government. That are influenced by these gender norms that you see on the left. For instance, financial service providers do not invest in even understanding female entrepreneurs' financial services needs and capacities because they believe that women should not make financial decisions independently. This happens in many, many markets. Or government has not enacted any changes in movable collateral registry legislation, for instance. It's still very much focused on men because many people believe, individuals believe that then make up these collective expectations that women should not have assets in their own name. And those kind of behaviors that are based on these gender norms influence and create these constraints in the financial system that then result in women being excluded. So there could be a lack of suitable financial services that consider barriers for women on the supply side, or indeed physical assets that are required as collateral for loans actually make it more difficult for women to access credit. And on the demand side, of course, there are challenges. Female entrepreneurs may not feel that they have the permission or the skills to use digital payment services, for instance, because they're not supposed to do in their way. So these gender norms influence both the incentives and the capacities of everyone in the system to actually be able to include women in the financial system. So any efforts, and we can move to the next slide, any efforts to create more gender equitable financial systems that can actually increase women's financial inclusion and their empowerment really need to be intentional about tackling the root causes. And you do that by consistently asking why the market system is not functioning as it's supposed to do to serve and empower women. And for systemic change like that, funders need to first diagnose and create a good understanding of how gender norms shape the behavior of all these system actors. And then based on that understanding, design interventions that really seek behavior change at multiple levels, at the level of the community, household levels, but also the financial service providers and the support service industry and the policymaker level, for instance. And solutions should, at a minimum, be gender intentional. And if possible, try to influence norm change. And Sophie already alluded to the fact that we've seen it work. We have seen that sometimes by structuring efforts and interventions or delivering certain financial services, you can actually help change misperceptions, for instance, that exist, or you can tackle unconscious biases that prevail in the market. And it's very important in this context and also to consider what can be changed and what is harder to change. We all know this is a challenging area, so we need to take advantage of the opportunities of relaxing norms also to move things along. A good example is during COVID, you saw in many markets that the access to mobile phones was somewhat relaxed and more women got access to them, for instance, to receive G2P payments, which were digitally transferred. So we need to make sure that we take advantage and leverage these opportunities of relaxing norms. A final thing I want to mention is that it's really important as we understand these situations, we diagnose, but then also have actual interventions in the market, that we do test things out and really create an evidence base of what works and what doesn't work in different contexts to shift norms and improve the situation for women overall, increasing their financial inclusion and their economic empowerment. As we learn more in this sector, as we know more and build that evidence base, I think we have more ability to also encourage other actors to take this seriously. So let me conclude by introducing what CGAP and FinEquity have been doing about norms in the past year. We've actually launched a peer learning effort among several funders, and you see them on this slide, market facilitators and funders that have been undertaking a social norms diagnostic in their different contexts, and that should inform interventions that they're designing along. These organizations are sharing lessons among each others and learning how to apply a diagnostic process which was developed by CGAP and Market Share Associates and tested before in Turkey with Syrian refugees and in Egypt with female entrepreneurs. And we will, of course, share more collective lessons from all these partners a little later this summer, and will then also be releasing the diagnostic guidance that we've been using and refining over that period. So with that, let me conclude and hand it back to Sophie.
Thank you very much, Antonique. And three things stand out for me from the chat and what you're saying. First, as Eden put from Bhutan, being gender neutral is being gender blind, precisely because you're ignoring the gender norms that matter. And so you need to be intentionally bringing a gender lens in everything you do. The second is the complexity of understanding gender norms because they're entrenched in culture, in behaviors. And the third is the complexity to address them. Because as I said, not only they create legal or regulatory barriers, but in reality, they also affect behaviors, including of women themselves. But with that, summary of what we just heard, let me now turn to our panel members. And we actually have 3 of the co-lab participants with us. So we're going to hear about 3 different circumstances under which the diagnostic was used. Let me first ask you, dear panelists, why did you decide to conduct a social norms diagnostic, and why didn't you do that before in your work? And I'm going to ask Florian, then Hajnalka, and then Ankita to give us their thoughts on that question. Florian.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophie, and hello, everybody. So why did GIZ decide to do a social norms diagnostic, and why didn't we do this before? On behalf of BMZ, the German Ministry for Economic and Development Cooperation, GIZ is promoting financial inclusion in Tunisia, and women economic empowerment is generally very important for BMZ. The new German government is pursuing a feminist foreign policy, which is nothing less than a reorientation of foreign and development policy. It's based on the conviction that sustainable peace and development can only be achieved if all social groups are involved. And the principle of gender equality is introduced and applied in all areas of international relations and cooperation. So in concrete terms, this means that gender dimensions are analyzed, considered, and actively addressed in all thematic areas. And this concerns the strengthening of rights, representation, and resources of women and girls worldwide based on their different realities. GIZ has been promoting gender transformative approaches for quite a while, and it's supporting women's financial inclusion in Tunisia in particular. There is an important gender gap of almost 20 percentage points when it comes to the access of formal financial services. So we are focusing on developing digital financial services to address women's needs and mobility constraints. And currently, digital financial services, especially for the bottom of the pyramid, are hardly available in the country. But it was also obvious that part of the gap was due to expectations of social norms and their impact on the supply and the demand side. We did a gender analysis when designing the project, but did not go as far as doing a social norms diagnostic deep dive. We all know that it's quite challenging to talk with people and consult about money, gender, power balances. And you have to be very sensitive to work on social norms, especially as a foreign organization. So the CGAP initiative, providing guidance, tools, peer learning, and hands-on advice came at the right time and provided just the extra motivation to start the diagnostic.
Thank you. Hajnalka.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation, for the opportunity to represent the joint program at this webinar. To answer your question, I would like to start saying that the overall objective of this EU-RBA joint program is to support FAO, IFA, WFP, and the European Union addressing the root causes of gender inequalities and really help them trigger transformative change processes to increase their effectiveness in contributing to improve food security and nutrition. Then in Malawi, which is one of the 2 focus countries of the joint program, we also we realized that there have been several efforts on behalf of financial service providers to design products and services specifically for women, including with simplified lending conditions. And nevertheless, women are still facing significant challenges in accessing formal financial services and products. So we also know, and as you and Antonique have already underlined, social norms are among the root causes of gender inequalities, in particular gender norms, if not the most important root causes. So we acknowledged that for us, in order to design and implement interventions that can really help youth and women members of the selected VSLAs that we are working with to improve their financial inclusion, we had to understand what are the gender norms and how they influence their financial behavior. right? We also wanted to understand how strong these norms are, how pervasive these norms are, and when norms can relax, who are the positive deviants, and also what are the promising strategies that have been already implemented. Now, as this was really the first time the RBA is engaged in such a systematic social norms diagnostic, learning how to do it was also an objective. Why we haven't done this before? Well, it is important to acknowledge that the RBAs, the EU, have been increasing their attention to gender transformative approaches in the last at least 6 years, and they have made significant progress in applying gender transformative methodologies. However, there was less attention to systematically address gender norms for behavior change. So this joint program really provided the context for the RBAs to engage in this systematic assessment. And through our research and the partnerships that we have been creating, in particular with CGAP and FinEquity, we became aware about the related methodologies. And we are really happy to be part of the social collab and to have been able to pilot the CGAP FinEquity methodology in Malawi. Thank you.
Thanks. Ankita.
Hi, hello everyone. I'm actually quite, like Sophie, you mentioned earlier about how gender norms can be, an inescapable reality that sort of shape the context of women and men around the world. And we thought that, understanding this very context is like the first step for developing any user-centric perspective or solutions. So, we know that any tool that focuses only on content of people's life and sort of discounts their contextual reality will always be limited in its use. So we know that almost 80% of women in India have bank accounts, but we also know that 40% of these accounts lie dormant. We claim that DFS is a very catalytic tool for women's economic empowerment, but again, in India, only 1 out of 5 women use mobile internet. So we saw that some of these reasons were, they have, structural reasons for that, but most of it is also rooted in women's social and economic context that has a very complex way of working. So we realized that if we wanted to understand how women can achieve their financial health outcomes, we need to step into that uncomfortable space of examining social norms that are a part of women's world and impact every move in her life. So, for us, we've seen how social norms have, very strong bearings on women's, whether it is access to resources or their financial behaviors. So for us, this collab was like an incredible opportunity to sort of witness and analyze how norms shape women's decisions. And then, through that, we are hoping, and our aim is to use these findings to not only inform policy, but also businesses, so that, we're not just designing products, but systems that can take into account these contexts and keep it at the center of design, rather than, addressing the issues as an afterthought. So that was the whole reason why we thought that it's absolutely important to start looking at norms as the root cause, and only then can we think of finding answers that are sustainable.
Thanks very much. And I think you're all highlighting fundamentally your motivation to design user-centric interventions, but you're also highlighting the sensitivity of the process of understanding these norms. And so we'll talk about the partnerships that are needed later on in this seminar. But before we get there, let me ask you a second question. What were the key findings of these diagnostics? And maybe as importantly, how are they impacting your programming, your choices, your strategies, your projects? And we're going to use the same order. So Florian, if you can kick us off with your findings and what they mean for you.
Yes, if you move on. Yes, in this slide, you can see some of the norms we have diagnosed. And the first norm on the top left corner is related to women's work and the income derived from it. And we found that it's generally accepted that women work. That has not always been the case, especially in rural and conservative environments where the diagnostic was made. So things are progressing, which is good. And women are even encouraged to work by men it might be that everybody realized that income generation by women is needed so that families are able to cover their basic needs. The responsibility of providing the household with daily needs ultimately rests on them. And this is also reflected in the other social norms that you can see on the slides. And Ankita will tell you more about the norm that women are responsible for household management and that they can borrow in this regard, but borrowing for investing in an enterprise is considered man's business. We also found out that women are expected to accept lower pay for the same kind of work than men. It's not a problem if they do not work, as jobs are scarce, but there are social sanctions if they refuse work because of relatively low pay. So this behavior would be rejected by family, neighbors, and friends, and the woman would not receive any solidarity from the community if needed. And most of the women who participated in the diagnostics seem to have internalized and accepted the idea that they can be paid less than men. So they do not negotiate their pay and accept this situation as it is. They do so because they observe a normalization of this practice by employers in the region, as well as inaction of local authorities in face of these practices, and everybody around them accepts this unequal practice. So this can have the effect that women can be considered less competitive by a financial institution, and women might be perceived as deserving less and they do not get the full loan amount needed. Or the women themselves might compare less terms and conditions and accept less favorable financial services. There is also a relationship between income level and the possession of digital tools. So women have a double responsibility and workload, but less access to DFS, which facilitate management of the household and the business. How do the findings impact our programming choices and strategy? Well, the results of the deep dive will only be available at the end of the month, but however, we will take up relevant norms in financial literacy interventions. For example, the message of comparing terms and conditions of financial services might be expanded also to comparing terms and conditions regarding work remuneration. We will also analyze and discuss the diagnostic findings with all stakeholders in Tunisia. And soon the National Financial Inclusion Strategy will be updated. So we will see if anything is of relevance for the new strategy. And the Ministry of Finance, which is coordinating this national strategy, has been closely involved in the social norms diagnostic. We will also present lessons learned from the diagnostic on a more general level within GIZ, because a proper diagnostic and transformative approach is time and resource consuming. So we have been thinking, and we can imagine doing a social norms diagnostic on a country or project cluster level. Then the insights can be available at an earlier stage, and they can be taken up more easily by several projects and stakeholders. So this is the direction we are strongly heading to. Thank you.
Thank you. Hajnalka.
Thank you, Sophie. So, as you previously mentioned, in Malawi, we partnered with CARE Malawi, but the research team also included researchers from the University of Malawi and the Lilongwe University of Agriculture and Natural Resources. And these are the 5 predominant social norms that the research team identified, mainly influencing women and youth financial inclusion in the 5 districts and 10 traditional authorities that we studied. Now, I will only pick the one that you can see highlighted for the sake of time. I'm going to share with you some preliminary findings that we have from the deep dive and the behaviors exploration. So first of all, it is really interesting to note that this norm, married women should seek approval from spouses on all financially related decisions, is strongly motivated by a gender ideology related meta-norm linked to the belief that men are the heads of households and they are ultimately responsible for all household decisions, including financial decisions. And this is really important for us to know and keep in mind, and as an eventual future area of focus, because shifting these meta-norms, and in particular this one, goes beyond the traditional supply side financial inclusion interventions. We also find that this norm is very pervasive, it's very strong. The majority of the main participants approve the norm. irrespective from being in patrilineal or matrilineal kinship communities. As we know in the letter, the property and other rights are passed down through the female line. Nevertheless, in these communities, similar to the patrilineal ones, men are still regarded as the heads of households. Another important aspect, emphasis was for us identifying the main reference groups, the influencers. And these are certainly the traditional ones like the husband, the parents, the in-laws, peers, traditional leaders. But we also find in the districts that marriage counselors, for example, have a very important role in sustaining the norm during the marriage counseling discussions, emphasizing that women should be submissive to their husband and seek their approval on all decisions. Now, we also identified the sanctions and the rewards that keep this norm in practice, and they are very strong, both the sanctions and the rewards. And this is really important for us to know again, because the perceived changes in the social support or the backlash, the sanctions, will be an indicator of the norm change. And so this can help us monitor our interventions on the short and on the long term. We identified some of the circumstances in which norm can relax, and these are, for example, in polygamous marriages, where the first or the second wife, indicating the context specificity, depending on the marriage versus residence system, would have more freedom to take decisions, including financial decisions, because of the lower, lower attention or presence of the husband and the male relatives. And finally, we also identified key positive deviants, and these are, for example, the married women who went against the will of their husband. They joined a VSLA, received a loan, and started a successful business. There was a very illustrative example when a husband became sick and the woman could provide for the school fees of their children because she had savings. Now, the importance of this is that these actors can be role models, and they can share their stories of change with others. And in the program, we can really raise the visibility of alternative behaviors that show that women indeed can make good financial decisions at the benefit, at the welfare, well-being of the whole family. Thank you.
Thanks, Hajnalka. Ankita.
Hi, thanks. Thanks to Florian and Hajnalka for sharing the norms. I mean, you'll all notice that the norms are quite similar across regions, whether it is Tunisia, Malawi, India, but they have their own small nuances, their own shapes and forms, because women as a group are not homogeneous. So we've noticed that their capacities or their limitations are also dependent on their demographic, socioeconomic, and cultural context. And even the norms vary by these same factors. So in our immersion visit, what we were able to see was that women who are in collectives that have a strong group leader, they have more support in engaging in income generating activities. So, they get a chance to participate in the a workforce. So in those households, which have, who are part of these groups where the group leader is also revered by the community, norms tend to be a bit more relaxed. And what we felt is that, most of the collectives are always sort of graded by quantitative measures, how much loan they've taken and how much savings have they done. Whereas we think that it makes a lot of sense to map out collectives by these qualitative aspects and start working with them first, understand what are their different needs, and work on those very specifics. And drawing learnings from these very, sort of understanding, it can help inspire not only the other SHGs, but also the frontline staff. And like I think Antonique was mentioning earlier, that norms affect, it's not just they affect men and women in the community, but they also affect the institutions who serve them. Right. So we observe that the frontline staff who interact with these women, they have their own experiences, beliefs, and perceptions of working with the community. So all the staff acknowledge that, gender norms, they understand the norms that are faced by women, but they don't often recognize their own unconscious biases that exist. And even when they do, they don't know whether it can change. And in very few cases where they want those, to change those norms, they don't know how to tackle them. So we feel that what they also need is a toolbox for dealing with different types of situations. And that's another thing that we want to integrate into our program. At the same time, we also kept thinking that, why we need to study norms is because, they define the nuances in these behaviors that, different women from different segments exhibit. So a lot of women, actually almost all women, reported to have household debt. It's very common to take loans for household consumption and needs. And so it would appear to us that women are very comfortable borrowing for running a business. And we noticed that when it comes to taking a loan for their own enterprise or starting a business, women are scared of these sanctions that they might face, that if they fail, they will, face some sort of sanction from their family or the community. So while access to credit is a big issue, it is not the only one. And that's where we think that, we need to see how women can find confidence in running a business. And that happens when they have a social network of support, an infrastructure that understands their limitations and, is designed specifically for women and works on improving their capacity also.
Thanks a lot. And I think you've all highlighted in a way the variety of the norms, the context specific that these norms are, but also how pervasive and how much they really create obstacles for women to access financial services. Let's now turn to solutions. In the chat, you already have some great example. Jill, for instance, talked about TV shows that change gender norms. But let me ask each of you, not necessarily in the case of the countries that you just described, since your diagnostic are recent, but in general, give us examples of interventions you have seen working to address or decrease or circumvent gender norms. And we're going to change the order. So maybe I can go to Hajnalka first, then Ankita, and then Florian. Hajnalka.
Thank you. I actually would like to share some of the examples that we have seen working in the context of Malawi, but not only. So, for example, these are the IFAD-supported household methodologies, like the gender action learning systems that use household visioning, and these can be extremely powerful for changing gender relations at the household level. WFP is promoting participatory assessment methodologies, community-based participatory planning. And certainly our partner CARE uses gender-conscious practices like the social analysis and action, but also gender dialogues, which are often coupled with mobile banking services. And in the joint program, FBO is going to pilot the Dimitra Club's methodology in Malawi, which is a community engagement methodology to trigger social change at the community level. Based on our deep dive, we are also aware of other initiatives implemented by local NGOs or microfinance institutions. For example, training on gender equality, women's empowerment, women's rights. But interestingly, targeting couples and targeting traditional leaders and church leaders. Training couples on income-generating activities, emphasizing the importance of women having control over the income. Targeted training for men on joint decision-making. But also we can mention social protection initiatives where the requirement is to have an e-money account to receive the cash transfer. And this can be an entry point, for example, for accessing formal financial services. These are the experiences we wanted to share. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Ankita.
Yeah, I'll share some examples from the field that we saw. And, one of the observations that we made is that when women identify their own limitations and capacities, I think it has a higher cascading effect, because the moment women have a compelling need to use financial services, then even that it grows a space for, you know, financial service providers also. So one of the examples I'll give is of, you know, there were a number of SHGs that we came across who are running their own income generating activity. So one of them has been about 15 years old. And over the years, they've taken small loans to expand their business. And over time, they have the confidence to apply for a bigger loan now for, you know, expanding their business, earning a steady income, and they're even going to other local markets, traveling together to sell their product. So two things are important here. One, as a collective, I think they have more control over, you know, how they utilize the loan, because then they don't need to spend it on their household consumption. Second, I think the women, some of the women talked about that, you know, it's so much easier to take a loan as a group, because then it reduces their fear of paying it back. And, you know, it sort of helps them increase their risk appetite. And another case, I think this was again quite common, that how women enlist the help of men. So there were quite a few collectives and individual entrepreneurs who've taken loans through the collective and are running a business along with their spouse or a male family member. Because sometimes it is the male family members who can bring in, you know, a network to a business network, or the knowledge to conduct the business. So while, you know, it sort of doesn't guarantee a full agency of women in the business, it does set a different trend for norms to ease, at least. And some of these women also talked about that, you know, when your spouse is engaged in the same business as you, they find this emotional support at home, and, you know, more engagement in decision making about money. So again, we felt that it comes back to, we need to map out, you know, such collectives or these entrepreneurs to understand how they sort of, you know, transform this norm. And it will provide us really critical data to inform programs or even guide policy decisions, and, you know, give us more insight about what kind of financial services do they need. Yeah.
Thank you, Florian.
There is a good example from India where GIZ is implementing the project Here and Now on behalf of BMZ to improve economic empowerment of women entrepreneurs and support female startups. The project offers, for example, state-of-the-art incubation and acceleration support programs. And in order to stir a positive mindset change, the project launched a nationwide competition for film ideas on the topic of women entrepreneurships. Because film is a powerful medium that reflects and shapes dominant societal discourses and perceptions about gender norms. And it's a good instrument to mobilize and gather people, to initiate and facilitate discussions that contribute to a mindset change that recognizes women's ambitions, skills, and rights to be entrepreneurs. So there are 4 inspiring, highly professional movies about diverse women entrepreneurial journeys, which are screened in cinemas across India. And each tells a relatable story about courage, perseverance, and transformation. And these films have the power to both entertain and inspire and raise awareness about their aspirations, as well as the challenges faced by women entrepreneurs in India today. So together with follow-up discussions, we have seen that this can change the mindset of people and influence social norms.
Thanks a lot. And I think you're highlighting in a way the need for a variety of solutions to be brought to bear together, from working with women directly to working with their communities, to in fact addressing culture more broadly, for instance, through education or TV shows and others. So it's a very complex, in a way, field. So let me now turn to the questions, and we've received quite a lot. And I want to start with one question maybe for Antonique. Tell us, many of the speakers have mentioned the complexity, but also the sensitivity about understanding these norms, especially as you're a foreign national or a foreign institution. And also the sensitivity of communicating about findings with communities. So what kind of partnerships are needed to do that well? And how can we communicate with local people to get the best inputs, but also to influence behaviors? Antonique.
Thanks very much. It's a really good question. And I think you could already hear through the interventions of our colleagues that many different types of actors are involved. I think it's really important to work with local partners to engage people that really understand the local context and the sensitivities. And of course, as outsiders to a community, be respectful and realize what kind of things can be changed and what kind of things you cannot, maybe. In terms of the communication, I think what has worked well is to use champions and role models from the community itself to actually push forward. And Ankita also mentioned this notion of collectives, showing that someone is not alone, but a collective behind a change of movement. And then I think this notion of the unconscious bias is really important. I think we have so many stories and evidence already from people thinking that everyone else in the community thinks this is a norm, but they don't believe it. But then it turns out everyone else believes that it's thinking the same. So I think working with different types of communication channels, from small groups to larger campaigns and involving different actors, is what we should be doing. But one thing that I think we can all learn from this conversation as well is we cannot afford not to touch on norms because it's complex or because it's sensitive. I think kind of demystifying a little bit what these norms actually do in practice is something that's quite powerful, I think.
Thanks, Antonique. Now a question for any panel member, please jump in if you want to answer that. I think it's Eden put in the chat. The social norms are the underlying problems for women financial exclusion, but the financial inclusion agenda is mostly driven by policymakers. And I'd like to maybe add to the question, basically, how do we bring policymakers, but also financial institutions into understanding the importance of social norms and being willing to address them intentionally? Who wants to take that question?
I can go first if, yeah, so see, that's what one thing that we are realizing in our work, that, you know, if we want to change things, it has to be changed at the system level. And that's where policy services come into play. And, you know, for that, we need to create an evidence. If you look at it, there are such few studies that really study social norms in combination with, you know, how it affects the market. What we realize is that, you know, when one of the things that private sectors don't invest in women is because there is such low participation of women in the formal sector, or for that matter of workforce. And one of the comments also talked about how women are more in the informal economy. So what if we were to address these challenges, I think we need to talk about that, how then governments and businesses can, you know, capitalize on women's saving behavior. There, you know, it can increase uptake of responsible credit, and, you know, even talk about insurance and old age pension plans. So this can only happen when we create business cases for policies or for service providers. And that again goes back to understanding these norms in context of these services.
Thank you. Let me ask a question that was asked to Hajnalka in particular now, but you can make it more general. Have we seen negative, in a way, externality to addressing gender norms? And in the example provided in the question, the person is saying, when women get more control over finances and more access to finances, then in smallholder household, men become more demanding even against women, and that adds to their already existing heavy loads. If we see negative externality, is that a problem? Should we do something about this? Hajnalka.
Thank you for the question. Based on the deep dive, what we have observed, that men may withdraw their support, financial and any kind of support from the family from their wife, in case they become aware of their wife having, for example, a bank account or some asset in her name. So this is the negative social externality that we observed. And my colleague from CARE Malawi is connected, and he may give some more examples. But so this again underlines the importance of engaging men alongside women in the gender transformative processes when addressing gender norms, work at household level, really work with couples, and address these unequal power relations, the sensitization, the awareness phase, in creating common visions and strategies at family level. Sophie, if I may, I have seen another question related to youth, and that is really a very pertinent question, because indeed we observe that there is a big difference between younger and, let's say, older generation. Of course, older generation are the ones who are more supportive of the norm, and the younger generation are the ones who are really feel they are oppressed by these norms, and this is really due to the fact that they are somehow more literate, more educated. They were already exposed to some women's rights education. So yes, there is a generational aspect of these norms as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we're going to stop the Q&A now, because I want to keep the last 5 minutes for conclusions. But we will answer remaining questions on the FinEquity website next week, as I mentioned. Let me now finish this with one question for each of the panelists around what is next on your agenda. What are you going to focus on next? And maybe we can start with Florian, then Hajnalka, Ankita, and Antonique. Florian.
Thanks. Yeah, we will start with analyzing the deep dive results. And I already mentioned before that this will be taken up in financial literacy campaigns, in discussions with the national stakeholders for the new financial literacy strategy. And for GIZ as an organization, we will also share the social norms diagnostic approach and the tools and lessons learned from Tunisia with other sectoral departments. There have already been many requests to get information about the diagnostic and the approach. So we are happy to share our insights, because we want to join forces and do it together. So we are very optimistic that soon there will be more action to tackle the root causes of women economic empowerment.
Thank you. Hajnalka.
Yes, similarly to what Florian shared, we also have short-term and long-term plans. So the immediate next steps for us are finalizing the data analysis, but also to organize with CARE Malawi and all other relevant stakeholders an outcome mapping workshop, where we will analyze the findings in light of the project program objectives. We will look at with whom we have to work with, influencers, the positive deviants, formal financial institutions, and what norm shifting strategies we have to include in our work plans. On the longer term, we really would like to invest in systematically developing our capacities in understanding social norms, but also social norms diagnostic, and to make it really part of a project design phase as part of a broader gender analysis. And also to learn what are the norm shifting strategies and how we can incorporate those in our programming for gender transformative change. We are also considering supporting developing course modules on social norms diagnostic with the gender courses in the universities. And this could be really an important aspect of sustainability of our program in Malawi. Thank you.
Wonderful. Ankita.
Yeah, I think on the short term, I think our whole aim is to understand what are the different segments of women that we're working with. And because we can see that there are women who are a little bit ahead in the curve, what are their needs, identify that, and then, so on. Then the second step, of course, is because the good part is that we're working with the government, and it allows us to, create cases and help at different levels, help them understand where are the problems, identify that. So, we want to take a design approach to the whole idea. And finally, I would say that I think the whole idea is to engage more with businesses who are on the ground and help them sort of see through the evidence that we create, that how they also need to understand these norms to sort of create the services that they need. Finally, I think one thing we do see a lot of merit in the long term is to socialize this idea of looking at social norms, through local universities, and get more research done across different parts of India or regions around the same issue.
Antonique, 1 minute.
Thanks so much. Well, I've just been blown away by the activity during this session, and I think we're spot on with CGAP focusing on gender norms and figuring out what works, where and why, and sharing that with the community and continue to learn with all of you. And that's what we're going to do. There will be a successor collab peer learning event with funders focusing specifically on designing interventions, taking the next step in this process. So thank you all. This has been really great. Thanks, Sophie.
Thanks a lot. Indeed, let me add my thanks to all the panel members, but also to Nisha Singh and Daniel Contreras for supporting us today and preparing all this, and for all of you in the chat for participating with very relevant insights. I'd like to encourage you to continue the conversation through FinEquity. You can sign up and join the community of practice to continue sharing insights on this very important topic. Thank you very much, everybody. And we hope to see you at our next webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.